Hello! This is the Phantom Tollbooth by Norton Juster, Chapter 10, A Colorful Symphony. As they ran, tall trees closed in around them and arched gracefully toward the sky. The late afternoon sunlight leaped lightly from leaf to leaf, slid along branches and down trunks, and dropped finally to the ground in warm, luminous patches. A soft glow filled the air with the kind of light that made everything look sharp and clear and close enough to reach out and touch it. Alec raced ahead, laughing and shouting, but soon encountered serious difficulties, for while he could always see the tree behind the next one, he could never see the next one itself and was continually crashing into it. After several minutes of wildly dashing about, they all stopped for a breath of air.
I think we're lost,
panted the humbug, collapsing into a large berry bush.
Nonsense,
shouted Alec from the high branch on which he sat. Do you know where we are? Asked Milo. Well, certainly, he replied. We're right here, on this very spot. Besides, being lost is never a matter of not knowing where you are. It's a matter of not knowing where you aren't. And I don't care at all about where I'm not. This was much too complicated for the bug to figure out, and Milo had just begun repeating it back to himself when Alex said, Look, if you don't believe me, ask the giant. He pointed to a small house tucked neatly between the two largest trees around them. Milo and Tok walked up to the door, whose brass nameplate read simply, The Giant, and knocked. Good afternoon, said the perfectly ordinary-sized man who answered the door.
Are you the giant?
Asked Tok, doubtfully. Oh, to be sure, he replied, proudly. I am the smallest giant in the world. What can I do for you? Are we lost? Said Milo. That's a difficult question, said the giant. Why don't you go around back and ask the midget? And he closed the door. They walked around to the rear of the house, which looked exactly like the front, and knocked at the door, whose nameplate read, The Midget. How are you? Inquired the man, who looked exactly like the giant.
Are you the midget?
Asked Tok again, with a hint of uncertainty in his voice. Unquestionably, he answered, I am the tallest midget in the world. May I help you? Do you think we're lost? Repeated Milo. That's a very complicated problem, he said. Why don't you go around to the side and ask the fat man? And he too quickly disappeared. The side of the house looked very much like the front and the back, and the door flew open the instant that they knocked. How nice of you to come by, exclaimed the man, who could have been the midget's twin brother.
You must be the fat man,
said Tok, learning not to count too much on appearance. The thinnest one in the world, he replied brightly. But if you have any questions, I suggest you try the thin man around the other side of the house. Just as they suspected, the other side of the house looked the same as the front and the back and the previous side, and the door was again answered by a man who looked precisely like the other three. What a pleasant surprise, he cried happily. I haven't had a visitor in as long as I can remember. How long is that? Asked Milo. I'm sure I don't know, he replied. Now, pardon me, I have to answer the door.
But you just did,
said Tok. Oh, yes, I had forgotten.
Are you the fattest thin man in the world?
Asked Tok. Do you know one that's fatter? He asked impatiently. I think you're all the same man, said Tok emphatically. Shh, he cautioned. putting a finger up to his lips and drawing Milo closer. Do you want to ruin everything? Look, you see, to tall men, I am a midget, and to short men, I am a giant. To the skinny ones, I'm a fat man, and to the fat ones, I am a thin man. That way, I can hold 4 jobs at once. Now, as you can see, though, I'm neither tall, nor fat, nor thin, nor short. In fact, I am quite ordinary, but there are so many other ordinary men in the world that no one asks their opinion on anything. Now, what's your question? Are we lost? Asked Milo once again. Said the man, scratching his head. I haven't had such a difficult question in as long as I can remember. Would you mind repeating it? It slipped my mind. Milo asked the question for the 5th time. My, the man mumbled. I know one thing for certain. It's much harder to tell whether you are lost than whether you were lost. For on many occasions, where you're going is exactly where you are. Now, on the other hand, you often find that where you've been is not at all where you should have gone, and since it's much more difficult to find your way back from someplace that you've never left, I suggest you go there immediately and then decide. Now, if you have any more questions, please ask the giant, and he slammed the door and pulled down the shade. I do hope you're satisfied, said Alec when they'd returned from the house, and he bounced to his feet and bent down to awaken the snoring humbug, and started off again, a bit slower this time, in the direction of a large clearing. Do many people live here in the forest? Asked Milo as they trotted along together. Oh, yes, they live actually in a wonderful city called Reality, he announced, smashing into one of the smaller trees and sending a cascade of nuts and leaves to the ground. Oh, it's right over this way. In a few more steps, the forest opened before them, and off to the left, a magnificent metropolis appeared and reached into the sky. The rooftops shone like mirrors, and the walls glistened with thousands of precious stones, and the broad avenues were paved in silver. Is that it? Shouted Milo, running toward the shining streets. Oh, no, that's only illusions, said Alec. The real city's over there. What are illusions? Milo asked, for it was the loveliest city he'd ever seen. Illusions, explained Alec, are like mirages. And realizing that this didn't really help much, he continued. And mirages are things that really aren't there, that you can still see very clearly.
But how can you see something that isn't there?
Yawned the humbug, who wasn't fully awake yet. Sometimes it is much simpler than seeing things that are, he said. For instance, if something is there, you can only see it with your eyes open. But if it isn't there, you can actually see it just as well when your eyes are closed. That's why imaginary things are often easier to see than the real ones.
Well then, where's reality?
Barked Talk. Right there, cried Alec, waving his arms. Oh, right here, cried Alec, waving his arms. You're standing right in the middle of Main Street. They looked around carefully. Talk sniffed the air suspiciously, and the humbug gingerly stabbed at the air with his cane, but there was nothing at all to see. It's really a very pleasant city, said Alec as he strolled down the street, pointing out several of the sights which didn't seem to be there, and tipping his cap to several of the passers-by. There actually were great crowds of people rushing along with their heads down, and they all appeared to know exactly where they were going as they darted down and around the non-existent streets and into and out of the missing buildings. I don't see any city, said Milo very softly. Well, neither do they, Alec remarked sadly, but it hardly matters, for they don't miss it at all. It must be very difficult to live in a city that you can't see, Milo insisted, jumping aside as a line of cars and trucks went by. Oh, not at all. Once you get used to it, said Alec. But let me tell you how that happened. And as they strolled along the bustling city avenue, he began. Many years ago, on this very spot, there was a beautiful city of fine houses and inviting places, and no one who lived here was ever in a hurry. The streets were full of wonderful things to see, and people would often stop and look at them and appreciate. But didn't they have any place to go? Asked Milo. Oh, to be sure, continued Alec, but as you know, the most important reason for going from one place to another is to see what's in between. And they took great pleasure in doing just that. Then, one day, someone discovered that if you walked as fast as possible and looked at nothing but your own shoes, you would arrive at your destination much more quickly. Soon, everybody caught on, and everyone began doing it. They all rushed down the avenues and hurried along the boulevards, seeing nothing of the wonders and the beauties of their city as they went. Milo remembered the many times he'd done the very same thing, and as hard as he tried, there were even things on his own street that were simply blank. He couldn't remember. No one paid attention to how things looked, and as they moved faster, faster, and faster, everything simply grew uglier and dirtier. And as everything grew uglier and dirtier, they moved faster and faster so as not to see the ugliness and the dirtiness. And at last a very strange thing began to happen. Because nobody cared, the city slowly began to disappear. Day by day, the buildings grew fainter and fainter, and the streets faded away, until at last it was entirely invisible. There was nothing to see at all.
Well, what did they do?
The humbug inquired, suddenly taking an interest in things. Nothing at all, continued Alec. They went right on living just as they had always done, in the houses that they could no longer see and on the streets which had just vanished because nobody noticed. And that's the way they've lived to this day. Hasn't anyone told them? Asked Milo. It doesn't do any good, Alec replied, for they can never see what they're in too much of a hurry to even look for.
Well, why don't they live in illusions? Suggested the humbug. It's much prettier.
Many of them do, he answered, walking in the direction of the forest once more. But it's just as bad a place to live, where what you do see isn't there, as it is to live in one where you don't see what is there. Perhaps someday we can have one city that's as easy to see as illusions, and as hard to forget as reality. Aha. That will only happen when you bring back rhyme and reason, said Alec, smiling, for he had seen right through Milo's plans. Now let's hurry or we'll miss the evening concert. They followed him quickly up a flight of stairs which couldn't be seen, and through a door which didn't exist, and in a moment they had left reality, which is sometimes a hard thing to tell when you've done it, and stood in a completely different part of the forest. The sun was dropping slowly from sight, and stripes of purple and orange and crimson and gold piled themselves on the distant hills. The last shafts of light waited patiently for a flight of wrens to find their way home, and a group of anxious stars had already taken their places. "Here we are!" cried Alec with a sweep of his arms, and he pointed toward an enormous symphony orchestra. Isn't it a grand sight? In the middle of the forest, Grand Symphony Orchestra. There were at least 1,000 musicians, ranging in a great arc before them. To the left and right were the violins and the cellos whose bows moved in great waves. and behind them, in numberless profusion, were the piccolos and the flutes and the clarinets and the oboes and the bassoons and the horns and the trombones and the trumpets and the tubas, all playing at once. At the very rear, so far away they could hardly be seen, were the percussion instruments. And lastly, in a long line up one side of a steep slope, were the solemn bass fiddles. On a high podium in front stood the conductor, a tall, gaunt man with dark, deep-set eyes and a thin mouth placed carelessly between his long, pointed nose and his long, pointed chin. He used no baton, but conducted in large, sweeping motions, which seemed to start at his toes and slowly work his way up his body and along his slender arms until finally they ended at the tips of his graceful fingers. "I don't hear any music," said Milo. "Oh, that's right," said Alec. "You don't listen to this concert. You watch it. Now, pay attention." As the conductor waved his arms, he molded the air like soft handfuls of clay. And the musicians carefully followed every single direction.
What are they playing?
Asked Talk, looking up inquisitively at Alec. "Well, the sunset, of course. They play it every evening, and about this time."
They do?
"Well, naturally," answered Alec. "They also play morning and noon and night, and when, of course, it's morning or noon or night. Why, there wouldn't be any color in the world unless they played it. Each instrument plays a different one," he explained, "and depending, of course, on what season it is and how the weather's to be, the conductor chooses his score and directs the day. No, but watch. The sun's almost set, and in a moment, you can ask old Chroma himself." The last colors slowly faded from the western sky, and as they did, one by one, the instruments stopped and dropped out until only the bass fiddles with their somber, slow movement were left to play the night, and a single set of silver bells brightened the constellations. The conductor let his arms simply fall to his sides and stood quite still as darkness claimed the forest. "That was a beautiful sunset," said Milo, walking to the podium.
"It should be,"
was the reply.
"We've been practicing since the world began."
And reaching down, the speaker picked Milo up off the ground and set him on the podium next to him.
"I am Chroma the Great,"
he continued, gesturing broadly with his hands, "conductor of color, maestro of pigment, and director of the entire spectrum." "Do you play all day long?" asked Milo when he had introduced himself.
"Ah, yes, all day, every day,"
he sang out, and then pirouetted gracefully on the platform. "I rest only at night, but even then, they play on." "What would happen if you stopped?" asked Milo, who couldn't quite believe that color happened this way.
"See for yourself!" roared Chroma, and he raised both hands high over his head. Immediately, the instruments stopped playing, and at once all color vanished. The world looked like an enormous coloring book that had never been used. Everything appeared in simple black outlines, and it looked as if someone with a set of paints the size of a house and a brush as wide could stay happily occupied for years. Then Chroma lowered his arms, and the instruments began playing again, and the color returned. "You see what a dull place the world would be without color,"
he said, bowing until his chin almost touched the ground.
"But what a pleasure to lead my violins in a serenade of spring green, or to hear my trumpets blare out the blue ocean, and then to watch the oboes tint it all in warm yellow sunshine. And the rainbows are the best of all.
and blazing neon signs and taxicabs with their stripes and the soft muted tones of a foggy day. We play them all. As Chroma spoke, Milo sat with his eyes wide open, and Alec, Tock, and the Humbug looked on in wonder.
Now, I really must get some sleep,
Chroma yawned.
We've had lightning, fireworks, and parades for the last few nights, and I've had to be up to conduct them. But tonight is sure to be quiet.
Then, putting a large hand on Milo's shoulder, he said,
Be a good fellow and watch my orchestra till morning, will you?
And be sure to wake me at 5:23 for the sunrise.
Good night, good night, good night.
And with that, he leapt lightly off the podium, and in 3 long steps, vanished into the forest.
That's a good idea,
said Tock, making himself comfortable in the grass as the bug grumbled himself quickly to sleep, and Alex stretched out in midair. And Milo, full of thoughts and questions, curled up on the pages of tomorrow's music and eagerly awaited the dawn.